All right, let's get into this on a Monday morning. With us today, we have the Athletic's David Ornstein, Manchester United writer Laurie Whitwell, a Newcastle correspondent, and also fresh from recording an episode of Pod on the Time, we've got Chris Waugh with us as well. Right, David, let's start with you on this one. We're usually used to talking about player transfers and players moving from team to team. Now it seems the men in suits are just as exciting as United pursued Dan Ashworth at the time of recording. Could you just give us a bit of the latest as to what's going on with that story?
Yeah, although Dan Ashworth has described himself as somebody who can wear a suit and a tracksuit. So these are men and professionals of many talents, it would seem. First thing to say is that, and you touched upon it there, it does seem like the movement of staff and executives is becoming as, if not more notable than the movement of players in the January transfer window. And as one exec described it to me, there is a war going on for talent both on and off the pitch. And so I think this is a story that's only going to get bigger, because it's not just this situation, but there are a number of others around the Premier League as well. And it's really quite fascinating to see how these clubs are trying to build out their backroom operation to make themselves as robust as possible, to be as competitive as they can. In this specific situation, we've known for a long time that Ineos in particular, on behalf of Manchester United, as they tried to secure investment into the club, had targeted Dan Ashworth as being their ideal sporting director. He was their first choice candidate. And since last week, when the Premier League and FA gave their approval to Sir Jim Ratcliffe's 25% investment into United, the Ashworth situation has all kicked off. There had been no approach to either Newcastle United or to Dan Ashworth. But we soon revealed on The Athletic that Ashworth had received an approach and had informed Newcastle of that approach. At that point, there was still no club-to-club conversation. And it came to Eddie Howe's press conference on Friday, which I think was fairly extraordinary. I don't remember seeing something like that before, where the manager agreed with a question from a journalist that Dan Ashworth, still being the sporting director of Newcastle at a time where he was very likely to be moving to Manchester United, basically compromised sensitive information, and it needed to be resolved one way or the other as quickly as possible. Fast forward to the weekend, he attended Newcastle's match against Bournemouth, also some scouting meetings, but on Sunday, he informed Newcastle United of his wish to leave the club. He asked to go. And this broke in the media on Sunday evening. And then we revealed that Dan Ashworth has actually been placed on gardening leave by Newcastle United now. And therefore, you would suspect it's a matter of when rather than if he will be joining Manchester United. Yet still, there has not been a formal approach club to club. And this is where things will develop next. There need to be some negotiations. Is there going to be a compensation fee? Will he have to sit out a period of gardening leave before joining Manchester United? It is going to happen. It's now just about timings and finances.
Chris, I'm going to come to you in just a second, because I can see you just chomping at the bit to get in on this one. But Laurie, from a Man United perspective, like, who's leading this? Obviously, Ineos talking about best in class, right? So we've already seen a movement from Manchester City to Manchester United. Who's leading? Who's spearheading this pursuit of Dan Ashworth?
My impression of it is that Sir Dave Brailsford is very much at the forefront. He's got an existing relationship with Dan Ashworth from their working together at the FA in 2016, when Dan Ashworth was the technical director and Dave Brailsford was brought in as a kind of advisory role about the best practice at the FA. And they've continued that relationship ever since. Brailsford has got quite long-lasting relationships with people in football, and Ashworth being prime amongst them. So I think, as David said, he was always prime in their thoughts for this kind of role. A strategic builder of clubs is kind of how he has built a career. And I mean, yeah, obviously there's other people around the situation. Jean-Claude Blanc, who is also the Ineos sort of chief executive of sport. He's got a board seat at United as well once the ratification fully goes through. And Omar Barada as well, the chief executive. I think United wanted to, the incoming chief executive, I should say, they wanted to work from the top down, basically, realize that it's not a great situation to have perhaps, a sporting director brought in and then a chief executive appointed above them who they might not have known they were going to work for. So as it stands, Dan Ashworth knows that if if this all gets sorted, which we expect it will, that he will be working underneath Omar Barada, a kind of football-focused chief executive, which is a bit of a move away from what United have had previously. So, that all being said, it's a situation that is developing, but as we've touched on, it's going to be basically how much do Newcastle want to let Dan Ashworth leave properly and start work for you, Manchester United.
All right, Chris, let's go. Take it off, gloves off now, mate. I mean, look, it looked like Newcastle were building something. It still feels like they're building something. And now a key component in that, in Dan Ashworth, is looking like leaving Newcastle. And Eddie Howe, didn't say much about it, but you got a sense that he knew that the inevitable was going to happen.
Yeah, this is being portrayed by some, and certainly a lot of Newcastle fans, as that these things happen. How vital really was Dan Ashworth, but that misportrays. Newcastle set up an exhaustive search to bring in a sporting director. They used an external partner to get there, and it was Dan Ashworth who they wanted. And then they were willing to wait through his garden leave from Brighton, and then ended up paying compensation to get him early. He was the key builder of the club as they saw it, because Newcastle had a very skeleton staff and a skeletal infrastructure. But Dan Ashworth has started the process of building that out, and he oversees 9 departments at Newcastle, and he is the architect there. And he's only 20 months into a role which really he sees as being multi-year, usually 5 to 6 years to have a huge impact. Now, David described Eddie Howe's press conference as extraordinary on Friday, and I was there, and I agree, because I went in thinking, how is he going to deal with this situation? If Dan Ashworth hasn't communicated, usually Eddie Howe goes in with a straight bat, but that was never going to be sustainable, because rightly, there were a lot of questions to be asked as to, well, what impact is this having on Newcastle? Your sporting director, you don't even know if he's going to stay. And it was sort of quietly cutting in a lot of what he said, in that basically he made it quite clear that Dan Ashworth had to go out the door when he was asked about being privy to information, transfer plans, the like. He was even asked at one stage, should he even be still in the building at this point? Should he be marched out? And his response was not, no, he still works for us. It was, you have to ask someone above me, not me myself. And then there was also comments about, it was a really weird response that he gave was when he was asked, he said, the biggest compliment I can pay to Dan is that when it comes to recruitment, he basically hasn't changed anything since the first window before he arrived. And that was almost suggesting that, he hasn't really been as involved as people suggest. And that is slightly disingenuous, because Dan Ashworth has been heavily involved since he came in, but relationships were already built between Eddie Howe, the ownership, Steve Nixon, the head of recruitment, various other people at the club who had to work through that first window. And so Dan Ashworth came afterwards, and it was almost like building the club backwards to a certain degree. You would usually have the sporting director would appoint the manager, but that wasn't the case at Newcastle. And clearly the way that Dan Ashworth has handled this, albeit I'm sure he would argue, how can he do anything when Man United haven't actually approached Newcastle? There's been a lot of frustration internally at Newcastle as to how it's affected them over the course of last week, if not months.
Yeah, so this kind of news, though, for a Newcastle perspective, and especially what Newcastle are trying to build. From your perspective, if he does end up going to Manchester United, how damaging is this for that Newcastle project?
I think it's damaging in the sense that he's going to who Newcastle want to see as a direct rival. At the minute, they aren't, in the sense that Newcastle still don't have the revenue that Manchester United do, and so that's been the issue since the takeover happened. That on the field, certainly those first 18 months when Newcastle managed to qualify for the Champions League, basically the team jumped ahead of the rest of the club. The rest of the club has not caught up yet. The infrastructure still isn't sort of Big Six level, and certainly the revenue streams aren't, and that's why Newcastle have issues with the Premier League's profit and sustainability regulations, why they couldn't spend in January when the members would have wanted to. And so to lose Dan Ashworth, who knows all of what's happened at Newcastle there, to Manchester United, who, even given all of maybe the issues they've had over the last few years, still remain one of that established elite and want to be returned to former glories. For Dan Ashworth to be there building that rather than building it in Newcastle, it is undoubtedly a blow. Now, Newcastle themselves are adamant that they can bring someone else in, that things will keep moving on, and they will. But as I said earlier, he was the hand-picked choice to begin with, and to lose him only 20 months in, it really will affect things.
David, if Newcastle do get 20 million for Dan Ashworth, or a hefty compensation, Chris just alluded to it there, PSR for the bank balance, that's not bad, is it?
There's so much going on here beyond what we're talking about. So, firstly, Newcastle, as we understand it, want £20 million. That doesn't mean that they'll get it. Manchester United do not intend to pay what they believe to be an unrealistic fee. And if they need to wait, the word from Old Trafford is that they will. And perhaps other staff can come in the meantime, which we'll talk about a bit later. And what would be expected to happen here is that some talks will take place and they'll find some sort of compromise. Dan Ashworth will be on full pay as we hear it, and therefore that's another consideration in all of this. Do Newcastle want him sitting at home and pruning his garden for a considerable amount of time while giving him his full salary? And, there's a lot of politics. There was a big piece in the Times by Martin Samuel talking about how, Newcastle are trying to grow in a certain way. And within Premier League circles and votes that have taken place at shareholders meetings, Manchester United have kind of tried to steer things from a political point of view in a different direction, such as the financial fair play rules and the regulations around related party investments and transactions. And so there will be some here saying, well, this is coming back to bite Manchester United now. So that's the sort of wider sort of game at play. But in this sort of micro level, I think surely sense will be seen at some point soon, and compromises will be reached. But it really is fascinating. And I don't think Manchester United are going to have everything their way in this sense. They want a member of staff at Newcastle United, and they're going to have to perhaps go beyond where they were initially expecting to. At the same time, Newcastle won't want this hanging over them forever. They'll need to move on. They'll need to get a replacement in. So one thing I suspect is that these are probably sort of opening salvos, and then as we go forward, some common sense will prevail, I hope.
This is football. This is the Premier League, so common sense Premier League. I'm not sure. Laurie, am I right in thinking that actually this is a name, Dan Ashworth's name, is something that's been floated around Manchester United before? I mean, Sir Alex Ferguson, I know, thought this is someone that United should be hiring.
Yep. Our understanding is that Sir Alex Ferguson made a recommendation to Richard Arnold, the previous chief executive, when he first came in. So this is February 2022. So this is just at the time when Dan Ashworth was looking to leave Brighton and go to Newcastle. And it is a bit interesting, Chris, I don't know if you maybe could touch on this just briefly, in that, it's a similar situation, right? Newcastle had to wait for Brighton to kind of come to a compromise. It took about 3-4 months. Ultimately, they came to a fee. And what the reality of that in that intervening period is interesting. Gardening leave, is he absolutely just at home, as David says, pruning the bushes, mowing the grass?
I don't know where he is as of Monday morning, but he was on Tyneside over the weekend. He was there for the game on Saturday, and then he informed Newcastle on Sunday. So he sort of splits his time between, he has still, as he did when he was at Brighton, he still has his home in the West Midlands near Wolverhampton, but then he does stay the majority of the week up here. So I don't know where he is as of Monday at 12:18.
That's a great location update, that, Chris. That's far more detailed than I was anticipating there.
It's quite interesting because a lot of people have pointed to that geography as being more attractive for Dan Ashworth. I think he's got a son playing for Bolton as well, I was reading. So that may be a factor as well. It's quite interesting. It hasn't been the ideal appointment, you could say, for Newcastle, even though he was the one that they targeted over a number of other candidates who I remember in the mix. At the time, there were very strong reports about Michael Emenalo, for example, formerly of Chelsea, and some quite heavy suggestions that he was on the verge of getting it. But then Dan Ashworth appeared, and like Chris said, they went to quite significant lengths to get him in. Dan Ashworth, when you look at his background at West Bromwich Albion, at the Football Association, England national team, and then Brighton, and Chris alluded to this, actually Eddie Howe did too in his press conference. These are long-term jobs. You tend to see the fruits of your labour over a considerable number of years, not a short time frame. And I think even by his own admission, Dan Ashworth probably would have felt that Brighton was actually cut short because of the Newcastle opportunity. And this wouldn't have been in the plan. I don't think he would have gone up to Newcastle expecting to leave so soon after. And so it's a bit of a jolt to the system for everybody. One thing that's quite interesting is that Eddie Howe clearly, having come before Dan Ashworth, but also having done well there, has built a power base, a really strong relationship with ownership, certainly in terms of the UK-based ownership. And perhaps that didn't create the ideal environment for Dan Ashworth to operate within. Clearly, when he then goes to Manchester United, as Laurie outlines, he'll be working with somebody he's very close to in Sir Dave Brailsford, pre-existing relationship. And this top-down approach that Ineos are taking will dictate that he will be empowered, as will others like Omar Barada and a couple more who we'll come on to talk about, to build their own teams. And I didn't actually answer your original question, Ayo, on PSR, and forgive me, but we need to come back to that. Newcastle will be looking at this and wanting to get the biggest fee possible. They've not been able to spend in January. They're going to have challenges spending in the summer, all because of this process of balancing the books. And if they can get a big fee in for a sporting director who, if they are so important, why aren't we talking about them in the same way we talk about player transfers, even very average players who go for more money than this? And equally, Manchester United, they've got a challenge from a financial fair play perspective of their own. And every bit of money that goes out on somebody like Dan Ashworth is taking away from what that person, when he comes into Manchester United, is going to be able to spend. So that's another thing that we need to consider under the surface in all of this. It's really quite fascinating and remarkable, but it seems to be a move that Dan Ashworth felt, how often is it going to come around? Is it too good to turn down to be part of what many feel is an exciting new project at Manchester United? And if it succeeds, I and many others feel it has the potential, given Manchester United's history and status and DNA and fan base and marketing appeal and so much more besides, to be one of, if not the biggest projects in world football.
It certainly does feel, as David's touched on there, it's negotiation afoot, right? It's a game of poker. It is. We know what our position is on the Newcastle United side. You know, Ineos, Manchester United. Also, we know what our abilities are in this hand of cards. So he's on gardening leave, and you know he does have some secrets, I suppose, to Newcastle's summers. You know, is he really, you know, not going to have any communication with anybody at Manchester United in that period? That's a question that I'd be kind of interested to know. But does that then become a bit of leverage in Manchester United saying to Newcastle, come on, the reality of the situation is you just want us to pay you a certain amount of money. Let's just get around the table and negotiate that and come to a certain fee. That's ultimately what Newcastle did with Brighton. And just back to your original question, Ayo, that's at the point, obviously, when Sir Alex Ferguson was suggesting to Richard Arnold, the former chief executive, that Ashworth would be a decent person to perhaps have a look at and maybe employ, because Arnold was asking questions about the structure at United. How have they spent all this money on recruitment? And it's not really got them all that much to show for it. But my understanding is that when that call was made by Richard Arnold to Dan Ashworth, as I said, it was in the process of this sort of move from Brighton. So we hadn't, you know, fully agreed to Newcastle. It was sort of this exit clause. So at that point, Manchester United would have still had the same discussion with Brighton over that exit if they'd have chosen to pursue that route. But the proposal for Ashworth in that situation was more to work alongside, possibly even underneath John Murtagh, who was the football director, and that was something that Ashworth wasn't really interested in. As David's touched on, he's more of a, you know, the top guy, to put it bluntly, who would, you know, build out himself rather than kind of take direction from other people.
Laurie asked before about the situation when Newcastle brought Dan Ashworth from Brighton and there being similarities. And there are a lot of similarities, but there are also differences, which I think will play into the negotiation hands here. And that's, first of all, that the way that Newcastle at least see it at this stage is that they went through the front door to Brighton. They were quite clear all along, and that they don't see Manchester United necessarily so far have acted in the same way. They see this as being almost a public courtship. And there's certainly frustration from at least some quarters on that. Secondly, whereas Brighton, I think, accepted that, although they didn't want to lose Dan Ashworth, they realised that Dan Ashworth was going to a club who probably had visions above what they could achieve. Newcastle have visions that they want to be, as Yasser Ramayan, the governor of PIF and Newcastle's chairman, has said, they want to be number one. Now, Manchester United, therefore, are a direct rival to them. So losing him to Manchester United, there is an issue there. And also, there is already a bit of tension between Newcastle and Manchester United over the course of the last couple of years, even if this is going to be another regime. There was a lot of frustration with Newcastle in January 2022 when they tried to get Jesse Lingard on loan and were quoted a fee, I think it was nearly £15 million to sign him on loan. It was £12 to £15 million to sign him on loan to the end of the season. And so there's some people who, certainly fans at least, are suggesting Newcastle, why should they show that? And just to be petty, because, this is football, we love pettiness. Even at the start of this programme, Ayo, when at one stage you said United and Newcastle United fans get very annoyed at that because they are Newcastle United as well. And it's that pettiness in football that we all love. And so they will want to see Newcastle hold their position as much as they can. And it's as everyone says, this is very much a negotiating stance from both sides. But Newcastle aren't just going to let Dan Ashworth go because Manchester United, this situation has unfolded like this. They still either want to hold him to garden leave, or at the very least, they want to get good compensation to release him from it. Because, and if you pushed me for what I think will happen at this stage, I think there's at least some voices at Newcastle who don't want to see Dan Ashworth start before the end of the summer window, because that's the concern, I think, at this stage, is he's privy to information, Newcastle's outline plans going into that. And if they can, certainly they would be keen for that not to happen. Whether that turns out in practice once they get around the negotiating table, we shall see. But I would say that is certainly where some people at Newcastle see these things as being.
Yeah, very quickly, I just want to talk about both sets of fans. And I know, Chris, you guys have been asking fans to send in some questions, which are going to go online tomorrow from your perspective. What kind of questions are coming in from Newcastle fans about this situation?
A lot of the questions are, what do Newcastle do next in terms of... there's almost this acceptance that Dan Ashworth's gone or he is going. So obviously he's on gardening leave. It felt untenable from Friday. I'd written a column on Friday basically that it felt untenable after Eddie Howe's press conference that Dan Ashworth would stay after that. It already was heading that way anyway, and now it certainly is untenable. He's been placed on gardening leave. That relationship's not going to be rebuilt. But what do Newcastle do next? Dan Ashworth was seen as a club builder. Now some of that is already in place. We know that a lot of the fruits of that won't come until sort of 3-4 years down the line, maybe, certainly at academy level and elsewhere. And there are still changes that need to be made. But do they need someone like Dan Ashworth, who refers to himself, it's become almost a cliche, but he refers to himself as sort of the hub of the wheel and the spokes come off it in different departments. He's not necessarily a specialist in recruitment or a specialist in any of the other areas. He brings the right people in below him. So do Newcastle decide we still need a club builder, or is the infrastructure there now and that they go for a slightly different model where it's a slightly different specialism that a sporting director or whatever position it may be? That is where all the questions are with Newcastle now. Do they still have the same ambitions as before? Everyone at Newcastle is categorically, yes, we do. But the second question is then, how do you replace Dan Ashworth? More than who so far is what do they want to replace him with? Then it becomes who would they look to bring in?
Okay, Chris, I know you've got to head off, but thanks so much for joining us as we move to the second part. Make sure you listen to Newcastle's podcast with Chris, Pod on the Tyne, which is out later today as well. Nice one, Chris.
Thanks very much, guys.
Yeah, Laurie, just very quickly for Manchester United fans, Chris has dropped an article on Dan Ashworth, and Kevin Thewell in that article states, who's Everton's director of football, states, he's described him as an aspiring administrator, the best director of football this country has produced. Look, Manchester United have gone through several false storms at this moment in time. Should Manchester United fans temper excitement or genuinely feel, okay, we're getting best in class? This is a new United. Hoyland scoring. Everything's looking tickety-boo.
Everything's fine, isn't it, Ayo? 4 wins on the bounce. No problems at all at Kenilworth Road. I mean, you have to temper everything with United. We've been here. Manchester United, sorry, Chris. I know he's gone now, but I'll try and maintain that. Because we've been here before with Manchester United, and, I think this is different in the sense of you've got people here now who have real momentum and force of personality to try and get things done. Whether they have whether they make the right decisions remains to be seen, but they do have a background in making a success of, Sir Jim Ratcliffe in terms of his business, absolutely incredible sort of rise that Ineos have had. And then also Sir Dave Brailsford with the cycling. I know it wasn't without controversy, but you have to go back to the way that he transformed British cycling and got, these elite performers. So, and he says he's not a football expert, but he feels, and Ratcliffe feels, that, he can pick the right people. And by all accounts, Dan Ashworth is a very good football executive in what United need. Somebody that can come in and identify the kind of positions that are required, and then also get the best out of those people and make sure that, recruitment is on point, making sure that you can go for a player at the right moment and knowing who to call in different moments. Ashworth has got good relationships with a lot of, agents in the football world, which I think has been a bit of an issue for United previously, in that, they've maybe missed out on players because they haven't been able to go on the front foot for them, or have the kind of strength of their convictions that this is a player that they really should go for, and get them at a cheaper price, rather than kind of wait until they've perhaps produced elsewhere and then they've had to pay a higher fee for them, which goes back to the financial fair play, the PSR regulations and calculations. That's why United are in this kind of tight position, because they've overspent for several years. So I do feel like that this is a bit different than the previous times when we've heard about the change, because previously, so the last time there was this kind of, United changing their structure was when, John Murtagh was appointed football director and Darren Fletcher was appointed technical director. And that was, Edward Wood as executive vice chairman saying, we're going to go down this more sort of continental route and have, a better link between the board and the manager. And really it didn't work out like that. It never really was going to, because these were internal appointments with people that hadn't done that level of job before. Whereas with Dan Ashworth, he's proven over the years at West Bromwich Albion, at Brighton, at the FA, and more recently at Newcastle, although I know it's, perhaps not as deeper pool to have a sample of at Newcastle, but he's done this job, so it does fit. And yeah, whether or not you can actually then make Manchester United a success, because there's a different level of expectation at Manchester United. There's more scrutiny. It's perhaps more difficult in certain scenarios to get value for money, because people see Manchester United calling and they had a few zeros on. But I still think there's very many ways in which Man United could be better at getting good value for players, and also just the kind of cohesive unit as a football club, all the different departments coming together, which is something that Dan Ashworth should be able to help with. And it's not going to be alone, is it? I mean, David's already reported about Jason Wilcox being identified as a senior football role. I believe there'll be somebody else coming in as well, at least. And this feels like it's going to be an evolving situation that Brailsford is very hands-on with.
Yeah, I mean, David, let's talk about that. The infrastructure, or the structure, I should say, at Manchester United. Omar Barada already coming in from Manchester City, potential Ashworth, and also a name Laurie's just mentioned in Jason Wilcox. What is it starting to look like behind the scenes at Manchester United now?
Look, it's abundantly clear that Ineos will have had a very defined picture of what they envisaged for Manchester United. It might not be too dissimilar to how they've operated in cycling or sailing or their other football clubs, OGC Nice and Lausanne Sport. But tailoring it towards Manchester United and what their due diligence uncovered on how things are at the moment and what they would like to see and what they believe is needed to succeed going forward. It was clearly a chief executive of real potential, because Omar Barada had not had or held that position before, but had the required skill set, and took everybody by surprise when we broke that story and they announced it. And it's seen as being very impressive. Laurie describes it as a more sort of football type chief executive, and many Man United fans welcome that. Let's see how it unfolds. And then he would build this team below him. And so a key appointment being sporting director. Of course, it would need Omar Barada's approval, but Ineos, as we've explained, would have already had Dan Ashworth in their thinking. There were others who were rumoured and reported on to be in the frame. Just off the top of my head, there were people like Julian Ward, who did a very good job at Liverpool, although his time as sporting director after Michael Edwards was quite brief. Let's see if anything develops on that front. We're not aware of it just yet, but certainly that's a name that's been circulated. Paul Mitchell was another one as well. He, like Julian Ward, is available. Ward left Liverpool. Mitchell has left Monaco. But my information is that very early on, he made clear to Ineos, who he will know from the south of France, because of course they've got Nice and he worked at Monaco, and I think they all lived in the same area, and they're largely English. That this was an opportunity that he did not wish to pursue. And that's created a bit of confusion among all involved as to how there have been so many links with him and Manchester United. But I think he's returning to the UK and told them he wants to spend time with his family ahead of deciding on his next pursuit. Who else has been in the frame? There have been names such as Dougie Freedman, who's done and is doing a really good job at Crystal Palace, is certainly on the recruitment side and is said to be quite close to Sir Alex Ferguson. Roy Hodgson will obviously know him well, and Roy Hodgson knows the Ineos guys pretty closely too. And other names started to float around. There was one report on the former Milan duo of Paolo Maldini and Ricky Massara. I think that was a little bit left field. I even saw at one point Max Erbel, who was in the process of moving to Bayern Munich, Lee Congerton, who was formerly of Leicester City and at Atalanta. So all these names came around, but I think in reality they would have been focused on Ashworth. And then it's no surprise now that names that they are actually going for are coming somewhat out of the blue. So it's almost like the forecasted ones are not coming to fruition. Omar Barada, nobody had spoken about him, and then bang. And then we broke the news last week that they are working on a deal to appoint Jason Wilcox, as Laurie mentioned, from Southampton. He's the director of football there. We don't know of an official approach to Southampton yet, but he is aware of the interest. And Omar Barada worked with him previously at Manchester City, where he came up from youth coach to head of academy and so on. He's not been at Southampton long, but he is very well regarded in the game. And Laurie mentions one more appointment, which we think may be to sort of head up operations on Manchester United, Nice and Lausanne as sort of like the multi-club model. Within those, there could be further appointments, no doubt, in time, because this feels like a transformation. And that's why you're seeing names like Kyle McCauley in the newspapers over the weekend. He's currently an analyst at Chelsea. He moved there with Graham Potter from Brighton. And if Dan Ashworth is coming to Manchester United, then the Brighton link naturally arises again.
Yeah, the jigsaw's slowly coming together here, isn't it?
Exactly. The pieces are falling like Tetris. And then you have another name in the public domain is Sam Jewell, who's currently the head of recruitment at Brighton. He's the son of the former manager Paul Jewell. And he has been linked with United, although we think it's most likely he will actually move to Chelsea in this sort of merry-go-round. And that has led some to suspect that could this be paving the way for the next manager of Manchester United or head coach to be Graham Potter. And we know he's very highly thought of by Ineos. There's been a meeting, I think it was more in relation to Nice. But I can only go on the information that I've got at the moment, and that's that they're behind Erik ten Hag for now, and they want to build with him going forward. You never know in football. Things can, of course, change from their perspective, from a manager's perspective too. But I think they feel they're on a pretty good track with him at the moment. And so what we're seeing here is a picture of even more change at Old Trafford. And a question that will presumably come on to is what happens with the existing staff there, because there is great uncertainty over them as well.
Yeah, I'll come to you on that one in a second, David. But Laurie, I mean, we've mentioned some big names there. Dan Ashworth, Omar Barada, Jason Wilcox, who when he was at City was, in charge of players like Phil Foden, Rico Lewis, Oscar Bob. I mean, big names, Cole Palmer. And look where those young stars have gone. Obviously, I want to temper excitement, but I mean, you're seeing a bit of I would say, a fantastic group of executives potentially coming to Manchester United to take the club to the next level.
I think it's definitely exciting times in a sense of, change happening. And certainly from an Ineos perspective, they feel that making these kind of bold appointments quickly, if they do manage to succeed in all of them, but it does feel that it could go that way, spreads momentum around a club like Manchester United, where there has been a case of inertia for several years because of the Glazer ownership, having to run everything by Joel Glazer, the distance of kind of having that person at the very top of the tree, just that gap means that things happen slowly, and then also just in general, the executive sort of team, are they as decisive as they could be in this period? So I think the Ineos idea is to kind of come in with a bang and make sure that people are kind of taking notice and, okay, this is serious. We better book up our ideas if we're a staff member at Manchester United, if we want to stay on this train. And it's very difficult in football to pinpoint exactly who has done what at which moment. That you've always got somebody that wants to put their hand up for a success story and kind of shies away when perhaps that player sort of dips off, and so and certainly people's stock rises and falls at different moments depending on results on the pitch. But I think what you have to go with and boil it down to is, what are these people doing as their processes? Are they good at getting back to people? Do they have strong relationships with the relevant individuals? Are they honourable? Can you do they have a good eye for talent and a ability to kind of go for that person at the right moment? So all these factors, I think if you kind of accept that there can be fluctuations in form for players at different points, that these are the guys that you want to go for. So I think, and we can all say that we've heard good things about Berardo, good things about Ashworth, good things about Wilcox. What I would say is that I think maybe they have to be a little bit guarded, not just to kind of appoint, Man City chief exec Wilcox, who was successful at Manchester City. He has also done good work at Southampton, appointing Russell Martin, and that looks like a really strong appointment. But I feel like they do just need to be careful not to a copy and paste job really in Manchester City. That being said, I am told that they're sort of alert to that danger, I suppose, and they know that United is a historical original club, and that they kind of want to assemble a team of people that can kind of collaborate, but also justifiably go up against each other at certain moments if you need to have that conflict and to produce a better result. But we'll see in the fullness of time, I suppose, how the full team looks, and then all the different responsibilities.
Yeah, Laurie reminded me of a point that I meant to mention previously, is that I think this, while being defined in theory in their heads in the months leading up to this investment, is also quite malleable and sort of shapeable, if that's a word, and subject to change. They'll learn as they go that this person may be more suitable than this person, or now we've got this person in, our views are slightly different. Of course, unless they had this grand plan of Omar Berrada for a long, long time, which we don't think they did, suddenly he comes in and there will be a new voice in the room and around the table and in the thinking, who will bring different candidates to the table, different ways of working. So while I do think they had a plan, that plan can shift and adapt according to the people, the environment, and just the fact that they're getting more to grips with Manchester United by the hour, I'm sure, inside Carrington and Old Trafford, and the industry and English football, the Premier League, which Ineos are experiencing for the first time. And no doubt that will create some anxiety and maybe even distress among some people inside United now, because they won't know, are we coming? Are we going? This is not how we work. This is so different. And that change will not be easy for many.
Yeah, that's the thing, and you alluded to it earlier, David. Do we have any thoughts of any more outgoings and incomings at Manchester United? Because, you want to maintain a club DNA, but that will also be affected by the people leaving the club as well. Anyone shuffling their seats, wondering whether or not they might be here? Anyone?
Yeah, I might throw it over to Laurie, but just my input is that there will be natural uncertainty, because United have a football director in John Murtagh. They have a technical director in Darren Fletcher. There are others around them, like a deputy football director in Andy O'Boyle, a head of negotiations type role in Matt Hargreaves, a chief scout in Steve Brown. And all of these people, no doubt, will want some clarity on where they stand, where things go from here. And maybe Ineos want to keep some or all of them, but what is the role going to be? Do they want to stay in that new role? So many conversations need to take place now that this deal is going to be announced officially, we think, this week. And so I think those next 2-3 weeks and couple of months heading into the summer are just absolutely vital to establish what happens to the existing people. Do they stay in their roles? Do they move into different roles? It cannot be easy for them hearing all of this noise while they're currently working on a business as usual basis, because they are planning towards the summer transfer window and they are running the club on a day-to-day basis. But you're sort of doing so with one hand tied because you don't know where you'll be come the summer.
Yeah, I mean, as David's touched on there, I think that's absolutely right. There's probably been quite a lot of political jockeying behind the scenes. In fact, I know there has since the Ineos were revealed as actually the deal happening, because people are, understandably, justifiably trying to protect themselves. This is an unsettling time for many. As you've touched on there, the football director, John Murtagh, his position has been under scrutiny since this deal was announced, because Ineos came in with the intention of appointing a sporting director. Now, if Dan Ashworth is to be that person, does he? How does he see that role with John Murtagh happening? And that's what David's touched on there. This is kind of maybe an evolving situation where there might be, intentions, but actually until you kind of get to grips with things and see the realities, things can change. I think that being said, the sense has grown. I think that since Brailsford's been in the door, that John Murtagh will ultimately exit the club. But how that happens and in what form, I don't know. There has been a suggestion that he could and he would be open to taking a sort of reduced role or a different role, finding that he's provides a lot of value in terms of the administration of the club. He certainly knows all the ins and outs at Carrington. So whether Ineos look at that and go, actually, there's a different use for you here, then that's something that they'll have to come to decide. Darren Fletcher, I mean, it was always an interesting sort of appointment, him as technical director, just because he hadn't done the job before and he'd kind of come in as a coach under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, learning his badges, really. He's a developing coach as well. Now, obviously, he's got the heritage in Manchester United. He understands the club. He knows what it is to come through the academy and to work and toil and the realities of the situation. His two sons, actually, his twin sons, are now have made the switch themselves from Manchester City to United, and they're in the academy set up now. But I do think his role will be sort of reimagined, and I get the sense that he is someone that is very valuable to United, so that they would like to keep him around. But the technical director role, it's just not really what he's been doing. It's been more of a sort of bridge between the academy and the first team, and also helping out a little bit with first team coaching and trying to provide a little bit of that cultural background to the club, I suppose. But yeah, and there's other people in there. I am told that Ineos appreciate that there are people there that have great skills and great strengths, and perhaps with a bit more focus and leadership, they can really thrive. So I wouldn't say that it's absolutely a scorched earth policy at all, but just with a little bit more sort of guidance, then people can really and a sort of license to thrive. Then people might well take that. Just on Steve Brown, just a small point, and it kind of goes into what we're talking about here. His official role is director of football Just a small point on Steve Brown, and it kind of goes into what we're talking about in terms of how roles get delineated, but his official title is Director of Scouting Operations, so he actually doesn't really make calls on players. I mean, it was first sort of presented to me a few years ago when his name popped up in the conversation, maybe like 2018, 2019, that he was head of recruitment, so I don't know if that actually then changed throughout the course of the next couple of years, and it's definitely now Director of Scouting Operations. So he kind of organises the scouts, and United have had 140 over the globe and in full-time and part-time work, which is a lot of scouts, and they've actually worked recently to kind of tailor that, so that they're already making changes in that department. But yeah, these are all the kind of things that will be discussed and have been discussed, but it is easier said than done, I think, getting to grips with a club the scale of Manchester United and then trying to right the ship.
Tiny addition to that, I should don my tin hat, because Man United fans who are so excited about this revolution might not like or appreciate this evolutionary tone. But Ineos very conceivably will come in and look at all of these departments and see that some quite good work was underway. Yeah, perhaps it hadn't come to fruition so far, although there's been some good results recently. But I'm talking more long term. That many of these people, for good or for bad, have been at the club a long time, know its workings, and were trying to bring about the changes that were necessary. So it's not inconceivable that Ineos will ask what they were doing, find out, and say, oh, that's not actually too bad, and just try and enhance it and harness it in their own way. And that taps into what Laurie's saying, that some of their skill sets are applicable for what Ineos might want going forward. And they'll then have to adapt, because I'm sure Ineos, like any company in their position, will start to implement and infuse ways of working, language, processes that are not what United have been used to. And this is all part of like a blending process that everybody at the club is going to have to get used to, because I don't think many appreciated just how influential Ineos would be, given it was a 25% stake. They were presented as minority owners. But clearly they have intentions to become the full owners of Manchester United. We're seeing that with stadium plans and local area redevelopment, but also the way they are immersing themselves into the club. I think that has perhaps taken many of us by surprise, in that they are the ones running the show now. They have got the keys to this. And yes, the Glazers remain the majority shareholder and still have a significant voice in matters. But this is the Ineos show.
Yeah, well, some big changes still to come at Manchester United. Clearly, buckle your seatbelts, Manchester United fans. It's going to be a fascinating ride, to say the least. Gents, thanks so much for your time, David, Laurie, and also Chris as well. Now, don't forget to rate and review the podcast, and we'll be back for another episode tomorrow. Appreciate you listening. If you like this video, click subscribe for more content like this. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season to bring you the inside track to the biggest stories in football. If you'd like to listen to the full episodes for free, search the Athletic Football Podcast wherever you get your podcasts from.